Bonjour, bonjour. Today we're going to talk some more about le passé composé. So in previous lessons you have learned that most of the time you use avoir as an auxiliary verb. There are certain situations where you need to use être as an auxiliary verb. So up until now we've pretty much talked about making agreement on the past participle between the subject or subject pronoun and the past participle when your auxiliary verb is être. So that hasn't changed, all right? There's still a few little rules about reflexive verbs with body parts and that kind of thing where you don't make agreement. But today what we're talking about is something completely different. I hope it doesn't blow your mind. Today we're going to talk about times when avoir is your helping verb, and guess what? You make agreement. But here's the deal. The rule has not changed. You're still not making agreement between the past participle and the subject or subject pronoun. This time, we're talking about direct objects. So at this point, you have learned about direct objects. You have learned how to use direct object pronouns, okay? So there's this thing in French, when we come to the passé composé, about making agreement with direct object pronouns and past participles in the passé composé. So I'll try to keep this short and sweet for you. You have your lesson guide, I hope. And after the lesson, I want you to go ahead and do a couple of things. There's a quiz that you can take, and so you'll get familiar with the language in the quiz, and you'll work out when I have to make agreement, when I don't have to make agreement. Then I want you to do an activity with me, and it's called Parlons ensemble. Parlons ensemble. So you and I are going to have a conversation together. You'll see how it works. It's really neat. And the conversation is going to be the same dialogue that you will have already seen in the quiz. Only this time, you're going to get to practice listening and speaking with it. Okay? So now we're looking at the lesson guide together. And I've already mentioned or reminded you that French verbs are conjugated in the passé composé. They need helping verbs. So you're either going to use être or avoir, right? We knew that. I talked about making agreement when using avoir as an auxiliary verb when there are direct objects involved. So here's the thing. It's not just any time you have a direct object. It's when you're in the passé composé and you have a direct object, the whole thing, the direct object itself, or a preceding direct object pronoun. What I mean by preceding is when they come before the past participle. Okay, when that happens, when you have a direct object pronoun or direct object before the past participle, you need to look at the direct object pronoun and say, well, is it masculine? Is it feminine? Is it plural? Or is it singular? Those are the four big questions when we talk about agreement in French, right? So if your direct object pronoun or direct object is feminine, you guessed it, you have to add an E to the past participle. If it's plural, then you have to add an S to the past participle. If it's feminine and plural, then yeah, you have to add an E and an S to the past participle. Okay, so let's just look at some examples here. Oh, and before we look at the examples, I want to just remind you, because sometimes it gets confusing when we talk about pronouns. This rule only applies to direct object pronouns. So let's take, for example, the pronouns le, la, and les. Don't forget that me, te, nous, and vous can also be direct object pronouns, as well as reflexives and indirects. But sometimes they can be direct, so you might have to make agreement between a me, te, nous, and vous and a past participle if it is direct, if they are direct object pronouns. D'accord? Okay. So if you just happened onto this lesson and passé composé is new to you, maybe you should stop. I don't want to confuse you and go back to the lessons on the passé composé. But this is a more advanced lesson, which is why I've put it at the B1 level. So let's look at the examples here. Je vais laver les chaises que tu as laissées dans le jardin. Je vais laver les chaises que tu as laissées dans le jardin. Now here, les chaises, those are the things that you left in the garden or in the yard, if you're American, okay? The chairs are the things. How do we know that's a direct object? Well, because it answers the question, what? What did you leave in the garden? The chairs. So you have the full direct object here. This is not a pronoun. This is the direct object, les chaises. And this happens a lot when you have that relative pronoun que in the sentence. Because look, I am going to wash the chairs that you left in the garden. D'accord? So when you have a preceding direct object, like the full thing, not the pronoun, then you're probably going to have a que in the sentence. Okay? Les chaises. These are plural and they're feminine. So look what's happened to laisser. I've added an E and an S. Now it doesn't change the way that it sounds, but sometimes it will, right? Like if your past participle ended just with an S and then you had to add an E to it, well then you would pronounce the S, whereas usually you wouldn't. Okay, so the agreement is important. Okay, je vais laver les chaises que tu as laissées dans le jardin. Lesquelles? Lesquelles? That means which ones? Okay, lesquelles. This is a relative composed pronoun. And maybe you haven't gotten to that yet. But it is replacing the chairs. And it means which ones? Notice the way it's written, quelles, Q-U-E-L-L-E-S. This is because les chaises are feminine and plural. So I'm going to wash the chairs that you left in the garden. Which ones? Celles que tu as laissées dans le jardin hier soir. Celles que tu as laissées dans le jardin hier soir. Celles, again, feminine, plural, the ones, this is a demonstrative pronoun. Celles que tu as laissées dans le jardin hier soir. So celles, this is, well, it's a demonstrative pronoun, which is actually acting as a direct object because we're referring to what? Les chaises, the ones that you left. So we have to add an ES to laisser. You notice that que is there because we have a preceding direct object, right? Ne t'inquiète pas, don't worry, ne t'inquiète pas, je les ai déjà lavés. Je les ai déjà lavés. Don't worry, ne t'inquiète pas, leaving the S off of inquiète because this is a command in the to form and it's an ER verb, right? Ne t'inquiète pas, je les ai déjà lavés. Je les, so les, of course those are again les chaises, feminine, plural. So look what I do to laver. Je les ai déjà lavés, add an ES. So that's because I have a preceding direct object pronoun in this case. You recognize les as a direct object pronoun, right? Je les ai déjà lavés. Don't worry, I have already washed them. All right, so now that's when you make agreement when you're dealing with direct object pronouns or direct objects in the passé composé. But let's remember when you don't make agreement. It goes back to what you've learned before. This number one does anyway. If the direct object follows the verb, you have no agreement to make. J'ai laissé les chaises dans le jardin. Voilà, okay, what did I leave? The chairs. But the chairs in this case, les chaises, that's not preceding laisser. So we're going to leave it alone and we don't make any agreement. Does that make sense? I mean, that goes back to what you learned before, right? About using avoir as a helping verb. This might be a little advanced if you haven't learned the causative faire construction yet, and that's in my B2 level, okay, if you want to have a look at it. You're not going to make agreement with the past participle and the preceding direct object when you're using the causative faire construction. So look at the example and you'll see what I mean. Les chaises que j'ai fait laver sont dans le jardin. So this means the chairs that I had washed, that I had someone else do it. The chairs that I had washed are in the garden. So if I had someone else do the work, I didn't wash them myself, that's when I use what's called the causative faire construction. So you notice the verb faire, we have the past participle, F-A-I-T, but even though les chaises is a direct object, feminine, plural, and it comes before the past participle, and there's a que there and everything, I'm still not going to add an E and an S to fait, because that's a deal with the faire causative. Okay? If you want to, and I know that you do, you're going to go ahead and take a free quiz. Now, the quiz is part of this lesson. I've gone ahead and added it there for your, so that you can find it easily. I've also included it just as a free resource at the Love Learning Languages French Academy, but the free resource doesn't include this lesson or lesson guide or the Parlons Ensemble activity that I want you to do after you take your quiz. And that way we can practice speaking and listening together. And if you've never done one of my Parlons Ensemble activities, I think you're really going to like it. So give it a try. If you haven't yet seen my very comprehensive advanced Passé Composé quiz, you'll see a link to it there in your lesson guide. It's also part of the program. So I encourage you to take that as well. Okay, très bien. À bientôt.